September 1944. A liberated town near Orleans, France. Inside a damp limestone cellar, 4 survivors stand before a table covered in captured paperwork. The air smells of rot, wet wool, and old wine. A woman with skeletal fingers points to a passport photograph, found in a pile of abandoned German records. The face in the photograph belongs to a man who lived among them for 18 months, ate their bread, and drank their wine. The name under the photograph is not Marcel, the French patriot they loved. It is Klaus Fischer, an operative of the German military intelligence. Outside, American troops are moving toward the German border, celebrating a swift victory. Inside this cellar, the survivors are counting 34 names, remembering the night the trap snapped shut. General George S. Patton will soon read this report, and his response will redefine what it means to hunt an invisible enemy. This is the story of what Patton did when he learned a trusted resistance member was a German agent who sent 22 people to their deaths. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the truth buried under the rubble of retreat. Madeleine Rousseau was 38 years old, a woman from a quiet village near Orleans who never asked for a war. Before the occupation, she managed a small family bakery, tracking flour weights and bread prices. When the German army marched in, she used her ledger to track troop movements instead, eventually leading a network of local saboteurs who provided critical rail data for the D-Day landing plans. Her war ended 3 months before liberation, when the Gestapo smashed her door down, dragging her away to Ravensbrück concentration camp. She survived the starvation, the beatings, and the freezing winters, losing over half her body weight until she resembled a walking specter of 78 pounds. When the camp was liberated, she did not wait for a medical transport or a civilian repatriation committee. She walked back to her hometown, driven by a singular, burning memory of the face that had betrayed her entire network. She carried that memory straight to the American intelligence office, seeking the only thing that kept her breathing through the dark. Klaus Fischer was 32 years old, an Abwehr intelligence officer born and raised in Frankfurt. He was a master of infiltration, trained to erase his German identity and dissolve into the fabric of occupied France under the alias Marcel Beaumont. For 18 months, Fischer lived as a devout Frenchman, attending Sunday Mass, sharing scarce rations with neighbors, and gaining the absolute trust of the local underground. He wore expertly tailored civilian suits, maintained polished leather shoes, and carried a gold pocket watch from his aristocratic family, all while secretly documenting every name, schedule, and weapons cache he encountered. His reports to the Gestapo were flawless, culminating in a final meeting where he brought a bottle of fine wine to toast their coming liberation. The next morning, 34 resistance members were arrested in their beds, while Fischer slipped away with a promotion. He believed his deception was a masterpiece of statecraft, an elegant victory achieved by a superior mind over simpler people. By September of 1944, the German occupation of France was fracturing into a violent, chaotic retreat. The Allied breakout from Normandy had shattered the old defensive lines, forcing the German High Command to pull its forces back toward the Rhine. In the wake of this rapid withdrawal, frontline combat units often outpaced the intelligence networks, leaving behind a trail of abandoned headquarters, scorched documents, and hidden operatives. Towns across France were being liberated overnight, transitioning from total occupation to Allied control in a matter of hours. This sudden shift created an environment of profound uncertainty, where local populations rushed to celebrate their freedom, while military intelligence officers worked frantically to identify the hidden threats left behind in the confusion. In many sectors, regular military commanders chose to overlook the messy, internal conflicts of the local populations. They viewed the stories of wartime informants and hidden collaborators as civilian matters, distractions from the primary objective of pushing the armored divisions toward the German border. Many officers believed that tracking down deep-cover spies was a task best left to post-war tribunals or local police forces once the fighting stopped completely. They allowed suspected agents to melt into the moving crowds of displaced persons, prioritizing speed and logistical momentum over local justice. But the situation near Orleans was different because the destruction of the underground network had directly impacted the operational safety of the advance. The data that had been wiped out by a single informant was the very intelligence that secured the bridges and crossroads now being used by the American Third Army. The betrayal was not a historic footnote. It was an active military wound. The camera now focuses back on the cramped office, where the names of the dead are laid out on a bare wooden table. Captain Thomas Vance, a 34-year-old counterintelligence officer from Richmond, Virginia, serving with the Third Army, sat across from Klaus Fischer in the makeshift interrogation room. Fischer, still dressed in his fine civilian coat, sat comfortably, his hands resting near his heavy gold pocket watch. Captain Vance laid a captured German roster on the table between them, tapping his finger directly on the name Fischer. He asked if the man recognized the name, noting that 4 survivors from the local underground had already identified his photograph. Fischer did not flinch, looking at the paper with calm indifference, and stated that names on a paper meant nothing in a war zone. Captain Vance, leaning forward, stated that 34 people were arrested because of a single informant, and 22 of those people were shot against a wall. He added that the survivors remembered the wine he brought to toast their liberation the very night before the Gestapo arrived. Fischer smiled thinly, adjusting his lapels, and remarked that the captain was looking at a military operation through the narrow lens of civilian sentimentality. He stated that his duty was to the state, and the state required the complete eradication of lawless partisans who threatened the rear security of the German army. Captain Vance countered that pretending to be a French patriot, eating their food, and attending their church for 18 months was not a military operation, calling it calculated slaughter. Fischer laughed softly, shaking his head, and said that the French population was weak, easily deceived by simple gestures, and deserved to be managed by a superior intelligence. He added that an Abwehr officer of his rank answers only to his superiors, not to a field officer from an army of farmers and mechanics. He demanded to be moved to a proper prisoner of war camp immediately, citing his rights under international protocols and stating he would no longer speak to a mere captain. Captain Vance stood up slowly, picking up the dossier from the table, his face tight with anger. He looked down at Fischer, stating that his rank would not protect him from what he had done to the families in this town. Fischer looked away, his eyes fixed on the window, dismissing the captain with a wave of his hand. Captain Vance walked out of the room, instructing the guards at the door to keep the prisoner isolated and under heavy guard. He walked down the corridor to the field telephone, contacting the command post to report that the infiltrator showed no remorse and claimed immunity based on his aristocratic status. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His jeep pulled up to the gate with a sudden spray of gravel, the 4 stars on his helmet catching the late afternoon sun, the ivory revolvers prominent on his belt. The general walked in unannounced, his heavy boots echoing down the concrete floor of the interrogation room. Everyone in the room registered his presence instantly, the guards straightening to rigid attention as the cold air from the hallway followed him inside. He did not raise his voice, but the sudden silence in the small room was absolute. Patton studied him, his eyes scanning the tailored civilian coat and the polished leather shoes of the prisoner. He asked if the man was the operative known to the local population as Marcel Beaumont. Fischer nodded tightly, stating that it was his chosen operational designation. Patton asked if he was the officer who brought a bottle of wine to a meeting of 34 French civilians on the night before their arrest. Fischer replied that he was, adding that it was a necessary tactical measure to ensure they did not scatter before the Gestapo arrived. Patton asked if he knew that 22 of those individuals were executed against a brick wall within 24 hours of his departure. Fischer looked back with level eyes, stating that they were illegal combatants, and the consequence was entirely standard under military necessity. Your frame is that you are an officer of intelligence performing a duty for your state, Patton said, his voice flat and thin. You believe that your education, your Frankfurt origin, and your family watch make this a matter of professional calculation. You sit in that chair and speak of military necessity because you think a desk and a false identity shield you from the mud. But the reality is that you lived among these people for 18 months as a neighbor. You sat at their tables, you broke their bread, and you drank their wine while mapping out their graves. You watched them look at you with trust while you prepared the ink for their execution orders. Madeleine Rousseau returned to this town weighing 78 pounds because of your meticulous reports. She survived the starvation of Ravensbrück, walked through the ruins of Europe, and came directly to us to say your real name out loud. While you were collecting your promotion, she was surviving the very hell you constructed for her. You have a choice. You will either stand in the public square of this town and face the local police under the charges of mass murder, or you will be handed over to the counterintelligence corps as an ununiformed spy subject to immediate military justice. Decide now. Fisher looked down at his polished shoes, his mouth twitching as the silence stretched across the room. He remained silent, his previous composure evaporating into a stiff, defensive posture. The heavy oak door opened inward, and the American military police stepped into the room to carry out the order. They stripped Klaus Fischer of his tailored civilian coat, his polished leather shoes, and his aristocratic gold pocket watch, leaving him in a thin, gray undershirt. They marched him out through the back exit of the command post and directly into the center of the muddy town square. The autumn wind was sharp, carrying the bitter scent of wet soot and exhaust from the passing tanks. A crowd of local townspeople gathered along the cobblestones, standing in absolute silence as they watched the man they once knew as Marcel shuffle through the cold mud. Madeleine Rousseau stood at the front of the crowd, her hollow eyes locked onto his face, her 78-pound frame wrapped in a rough wool blanket. Fisher shivered violently as the damp cold seeped into his bare feet, his gaze fixed on the ground to avoid the eyes of the people he had betrayed. The military police hauled him up onto the wooden platform of the municipal scales, binding his wrists with heavy steel cuffs in full view of the entire population. The local citizens did not shout or throw stones, maintaining a heavy, suffocating silence that echoed the quiet night of the arrests. Madeleine Rousseau stayed in her village after the conflict ended, slowly rebuilding her bakery and her life. She recovered her physical health over many years, though she remained a fragile, quiet woman who never spoke about the camps to her customers. She married a fellow survivor in 1948, lived a private life dedicated to her family, and passed away quietly in her hometown in 1984. The ledger she used to track German movements was donated to a local museum, where it remains on display as a testament to the network. Klaus Fischer was transferred to a secure military prison facility following his interrogation and was eventually brought before an Allied military tribunal. He was convicted of war crimes and civilian executions, receiving a life sentence that he served in a West German correctional facility. He spent his decades behind bars writing letters to legal authorities, maintaining that he was a legitimate intelligence officer who had been treated unfairly by history. He was released on medical parole in 1972 and lived in complete isolation in Frankfurt until his death in 1979. General Patton never included the details of the Fischer interrogation in his public statements or his official wartime memoirs. He left the paperwork inside a locked leather case in his personal headquarters, where it was recovered by archivists after his death. In a private letter written to his wife later that autumn, he noted that the true cost of the European campaign was found in the villages rather than the battlefields. He remarked that tracking down a man who traded human lives for wine was a necessary chore before the real fighting could resume. Some historians argue that General Patton exceeded his authority by involving himself in the tracking and punishment of deep-cover espionage agents, suggesting that such matters should have been left entirely to the counterintelligence corps or regional French tribunals. They believe that a field commander should focus strictly on tactical advancement rather than local acts of wartime betrayal. Others argue that Patton's decisive action was a military's necessity, protecting the rear security of his advancing armor while delivering immediate justice to a broken community. What is certain is that the documentation recovered from the abandoned Gestapo headquarters permanently exposed the structure of the betrayal and ensured that the names of the victims were formally recorded in the regional records. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have handed the infiltrator over to the local populace immediately? Or would you have processed him strictly through the standard bureaucratic channels of the military justice system? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the truth buried under the rubble of retreat, make sure to subscribe.